I think we have this cleaned out sufficiently at this point. We need to be very clean right down in here on both sides, here and here, to get a good start with the saw. And I have to tell you, on this piece of wood, this Japanese oak, this took about twice as long as some that I've cut in the same size in white oak. It's extremely hard, a little bit, not really frustrating, but some fairly heavy work, but I feel very rewarded. The density of this, the finish it comes off the chisel is beautiful. The feel in the hand is totally different, so I think it was worthwhile. So before we saw our kerfs here for the blade, I need to, these are still strong enough, these lines. I want to make sure we can read these lines here. Yeah, that should be fine. These have gotten a little faded, so let's reinforce these. Let's see. Let's do it there. Right there. The saw cut will be right at the line of the mouth. And these are important lines, so there, that's better. You can see here that the bed is not quite back to that line. It is here, and that will affect the cut and the fit. So I'm going to pare that out, bring it down to that line. Seems true at the top. I see it's a little. Okay, that's got it. Make this a little more symmetrical all over. Okay. So the strategy is to start the saw blade. I'm using this saw right on that cut, and to bring it down right to our mark on the top, and then do the same back here. Now I find it easiest to do it between two stops, or if it's too short you'll have to work against one stop. So I've got the block here between two dogs on my bench to kind of hold it. It's kind of the fastest way. I'm going to make a little starter cut right here to make sure the blade gets a nice start. It's very shallow. You can see there. About like that, because you may not be dead on coming back up this way. And so and then bring your blade down, lower it down, until you hit that line up there. So that'll be the thing, it does the wedging action on the blade. Let's check and see how we're doing here. Okay. So you want to cut to this line that we had marked earlier, which is the blade width. You can see it here. Now just start the saw cut. See how we're doing here. It looks good. Deeper. So a little bit deeper there, but that's your 2 saw cuts. Now I found if I make a little tick here, which I can see through the throat, I can aim the saw a little bit better when making this little starting cut. Okay, so trying to get it right on the line. This is one of the more important things to do. Start it tight to the bed here at the bottom. Make sure your line is straight coming up and hit the mark at the top. So I just break that out with a chisel now, pare it back. Now keep your thumb on there. We don't want to putting pressure. Keep your thumb on the chisel, try and control it, because this can roll and then you'll have big problems. So keep your hand as far behind the blade as you can get it. Keep your thumb on it for some control and clean that out. Okay, that's a little narrow for that chisel. Let's move to my narrower chisel. Going to leave it there. Let's do the other one and check, see how the blade fits. Okay, this is a little hard to see. I noticed when I was cleaning this out, the one chisel fit the other on one side and didn't fit on the other side, suggesting my cuts were different widths. The blade is not at most a few thousandths off in thickness. So when I looked at it, the cut was not 90 degrees. It drifted, got a little bit rounded. The cut line on the top is straight. Now it's important that you don't pair these. You make this cut, and when fitting the blade, you never touch these lines again. But what I'm seeing is there's like a lump, shall we say, in there. It's not going to get full bearing along there. I have to pair that back without destroying this nice straight line here, so that we get the most bearing that we can on these surfaces. This is tricky. A lot of the Japanese chisels are pretty thick and sometimes won't fit in there. Most Western chisels will fit. And I use a wider chisel, which is a little dangerous, but I can see what angle the blade is at when I'm in there. The danger is you can tilt it the wrong way and then start destroying that line. And you want to do this as little as possible. And this is going to be against the grain, but luckily this wood is so dense, grain is less of an issue. I want to get in there and get that top of that tilted as far to the left I can, and just, let's do it here, and just get that lump out of there. Okay, that's as far as I can take it. And you want these corners here where it meets the side to be crisp. So if you've got a little bit of stuff residing right in the corners, you got to make sure that is out. And this one, now I'm seeing a little bit of that on this one, so I'm going to let's see, where's our best place here? Perhaps here. Let me get in there and just clean that little bit of miscut. Get that nice and straight. Yeah, good, good. Looks like maybe a little more. Little bit. All right, let's try the blade. First thing is check enough width. Oh, looks like a little tight on the width. I'd really like to see a little bit more because this blade in particular is slightly tapering, narrower at the blade edge. So let's pare that out a little bit before we go any further. Make sure you get right into the corners. Now you don't need a whole lot, at least not at this point. Don't get carried away. You don't want the sides too thin just because you're trying to get it smooth. Okay, that should be sufficient. Now, yes, you probably can't see it on camera, but you can see air here and here, which we should have because we've humped this quite a bit. That's probably a lot of air. This blade may end up shooting past its mouth opening, but we'll see. You can also see there's a little air right there, which means it's a little higher in the middle as we go down. So the way to fit this, there's several things you can use. You can use ink, you can use graphite, you can use Vaseline, and I was shown with Vaseline. Now that would suggest that you're going to get a snugger fit with the Vaseline because it's going to kind of lubricate your insertion. Graphite, you could say similar kind of thing, but basically, and let's get it all the way. What it's going to do, whatever you use, is supposed to mark the bed. So tap it in there a little ways, let's not break the thing. You can go a little side to side, back it out, and we've got some high spots right there. That shows the high spots. Two big humps. What you want to get, ideally, you want to get this whole thing black, and frankly I've never gotten close to that, but I've gotten to the point that it's secure enough to work. If you don't know, you adjust the plane basically as a tap. You can use a wooden mallet. It slows down this peening process on the blade, doesn't eliminate it. Tap the blade in, back the blade out by tapping back here, and I don't know if you remember, but we cut this out of a larger block that we salvaged, and this is part of the throat, which I've incorporated, in order to get as much length as possible, I've incorporated this into the plane, which I would cut later anyway, this chamfer. It saves beating up a sharp edge. So I'm seeing it up the middle. Check though into the corners, sometimes it's places you don't expect. Well, eventually your graphite's going to wear off. And you'll have to put some more on the blade. You can use a narrower chisel. So right now we're about that far in. We have maybe 3/8 of an inch to go. Personally, I would have preferred to see it about here to start. It was actually a little bit lower than that, but less air on the corners there, because I like to fit on a wider portion of the blade. So I just recoated this. So you continue this process until the blade gets to working position. Now, if you've overcut, there are some fixes, as long as you haven't grossly overcut. And if you get the blade to fix sufficiently for the use that you're doing, then regardless, it's not a problem. If it doesn't chatter, it doesn't slip its adjustment, and you're able to get consistent shavings of a type that you want, then you don't have to worry about that fitting really exactly. But if you're having problems, then it's probably, it depends on the nature of problems, but if it's chattering, there's a good chance that your fit is not very good. Well, we've advanced about another 1/8 of an inch or so, maybe a little more. It almost always gets marked here at the top. I think that's just from slipping it in. You angle the chisel a little bit because you don't want to reinforce the kind of stuttering that goes on with this kind of pairing process. Looks like it's time to recoat. We're getting some bearing near the sides now. Starting to get into the corners, which is good. You can see this chisel could use a little sharpening. You can see what damage you can do to your bench there. I think we're going to recoat this again. Make sure you check underneath here and in here for any signs of graphite. A lot of times you'll miss them, and that might be the thing that's actually holding up the fitting. Now, one of the things that's hard to describe is just how much pressure you should feel, how much resistance of the blade do you feel when you hammer that in. What's the right amount? Before you start damaging the blade. Good question. That's hard to describe, but you should pay attention to the sound and the increasing resistance as you tap that in. And there'll be a point where it starts to slow down, and then there'll be a point where it just takes increasing amount of hammering and pressure to get the blade to move at all. And that's kind of the point. That's it, really. You can always get the hammer to go in further. I mean, you can always get the blade to go in further by hammering. But we don't want to do that. Okay, we're almost home here. Some people like to use what they call float. I do have a float. I've never warmed up to it. Seems to cut slow, at least mine does. Perhaps I did attempt to sharpen it, but perhaps I haven't sharpened it well enough. Looks a little loose on the right. Okay, when you get, I'm getting down there, I have maybe 1/16 of an inch travel left. You can kind of see it there. When you start getting down close, pay attention to where the blade ends up, because sometimes you've been very effective on making your cut, and the blade is actually will start to, when it starts to get its final position, it'll cut into the mouth of the opening. So make sure that doesn't happen. We'll see how close this one gets. This little marking technique using the graphite is very handy for fitting stuff that you can't actually see. I've used it in other occasions to check stuff. I can't figure out why it's not going together. If you're doing something to glue, and of course you don't want to use something that'll resist it or impede the glue. We're getting a pretty good fit mostly. It's really easy when you're working this very top edge to jump out of the cut and slip and cut yourself. So as we're approaching here, you can see that little line of light down there, which is the throat. Well, it looks like fairly sizable, but it's not. It's getting really close, and so as it check to make sure it's parallel. I think you can see there it's not parallel. It's not as deep on that side. So just straighten it up. This is done by tapping it on the side until it's parallel, as far as you can tell anyway. Tap it down, and it's going to hit the throat. It's already just a few thousandths away from it. So we need a little bit more there because it's not descended all the way. If I tap it down all the way, it'll probably cut into the throat, and we want a nice neat line there. We don't want something that's been chipped out. So this is it's hard to get a chisel right on that, which is one of the reasons why it's not square right this minute. So if you can do a knife cut, and I can see it's not square, and that's one of the reasons why it's just about hitting there. So we don't want to make this any bigger than we have to, so it's, yep, that's right. So we get a nice line in which to set our chisel, and hopefully we can actually get our chisel in there and keep it in there while we hammer. A lot of times it pops out between this step right here and reaching for the hammer. We'll use the little one. Now we want that to kind of match our throat angle, which is going to be about like that. Luckily this chisel is just about wide enough. Well, we have the blade out. Let's pare a little bit more. We're seeing a good distribution of the markings. Most of the way across and most of from top to bottom. Now I started to talk a little bit about the float. I have seen some Japanese makers use a float, but they don't. The one I saw anyway only used it to kind of finish up these cuts that I'm making now. The danger with the float is when you stroke it with a float, you want to kind of round that. It's very difficult to not do that. You have to have a very controlled stroke. Which I frankly have difficulty controlling. And the blade's just starting to make its appearance. Got a pretty good seating. Much of the air has disappeared. We can try this. See what our markings look like. Let's do one more pass here. So, how far you can push it in before you start tapping it varies according to the kind of wood you're using. This one's quite hard and resistant, so I can push it down pretty far. On a lot of them, you'd only be able to push it, you'd have twice this gap at the blade before you'd have to start tapping it in. Now this one might end up being a little loose. But there are fixes for that. And the common fix is to shim the blade. So if you were to find that you were fairly badly out of whack of getting a nice snug fit and you had to get the blade, drive the blade down beyond it, the working depth that you wanted, you can tap that blade out and you can shim it up. And you'd be surprised. Now here's one I grossly misfitted. This has 2 or 3 layers of brown paper, which is the thickest paper, and a layer of copy paper. Now you put this down with virtually any glue. I find actually the glue stick works pretty well because once you put the blade back in, the paper is not going anywhere. And I've taken apart antique Japanese planes, and they've had paper in them, they've had newspaper in them, they've had actual wood shavings. So the guy pulled off a nice thin wood shaving from another plane and put it back in here. And you'll find over time that the blade will start to loosen a little bit, and you'll probably have to do this eventually. This one, for instance, is a little bit older. And I've had to fit a sheet of copy paper in there. So if you overshoot your mark in making the plane, continue fitting the plane till you get the nice snug fit. Come back and put 1 or 2 pieces of paper in it. If you're only sticking out a 1/16 of an inch or less, what they used to call onion skin, which is a very thin tracing paper, will be thick enough. You might find that copy paper is going to be too thick. So that's your fix. And like I say, when I made this one, I grossly overcut it. Still works fine. I use it for scooping out chair seats. This one I made out of cherry. I have 3 layers of brown paper on that one. The blade, I used blades back and forth from some of the planes. Spoon bottom, I used the blade from a hollowing plane. So I can set this to the working depth, and the grip on the blade feels pretty good. Let me back it off a little bit. That's pretty deep. There we go. You can see pretty nice mouth there, pretty tight. So let's see if we can get a shaving out of this. This would be a complete plane until the 1890s or so. Japanese planes did not have chip breakers. It's a Western invention that was introduced, and the Japanese are quite proud of the results they could get without a chip breaker before its introduction. So here we have a complete plane, 2 pieces. Not another plane around, only takes 2 pieces, not even a wedge. So let's see if we get a shaving out of this. First I'm going to back it off. I want to take this little bit off because it's a weak point. Alright, and then the thing we have to do to get a shaving, you just can't take it straight away, because what's happened, and I can probably show this. I don't want it so the blade sticks up. The pressure of the blade has pushed the wood out in an area about like that, or maybe about like that. And if you go to make a shaving, at this point you're not going to get a shaving unless it's very thick. It'll go from 0 to very thick. So we put the blade in under pressure, but not all the way down so that we don't contact it, and we'll level the bottom off. Before I do that, I want to relieve 2 areas, at least this wide, along both sides. This reduces the amount of contact area excuse me, of the plane. Some people will take it all the way to the blade edge, but it reduces the amount of area that you have to maintain, and especially if you take it to the blade area, sometimes we get little shavings in there, but there's a cut for that too. I'll show you that. So let's relieve that first before we flatten the bottom. Now this is just a few degrees off, and I'm just going to take it to the width of the chip breaker for the moment. If you have a plane that's a truing plane, you don't necessarily have to do this at all. The larger reference area gives you a better, a flatter surface. If you have a smoothing plane, you can do it all the way to the blade. How are we doing? Okay. Put it down till the blade is a 32nd shy of the surface, and we'll level it. Okay, I'm checking this with a straight edge, and I think you can see even in the camera that it's contacting the straight edge right behind the blade. It drops off at the rear end of the blade, and there's some light in front of the blade. What you want and you don't have is no light right in front of the blade, right at the mouth opening, and that's the straight edge is being held off by the depression of the wood behind the blade from the pressure of the blade. So that's what we need to get rid of until the mouth area contacts the work. Several things you can use to flatten the bottom of the plane. If it's grossly out of whack, I often use another plane. You of course can use a Japanese plane for this. This one, being iron, is always at the ready and doesn't need any conditioning before I start, so I think, being basically lazy, I grab this one first. Another tool that we will use is the Japanese scraper, made specifically for scraping planes, for flattening plane soles. Now, this was a square block. Alterations you can do in order to use this to flatten plane soles is you can take this chamfer off like this up to the blade, and this allows you, because there's certain areas you don't want to scrape, this allows visibility, you know, right where the blade is, without cutting into areas you don't want to scrape. Another technique I've seen is this is actually a rabbet. It's been cut back. I think you're getting reduction of strength by cutting that right up to the blade, though that probably doesn't make any difference in this tool. If you don't have this plane, and I would understand this scraper, you can just use a chisel. You know, the chisel is used in this manner, cross grain, similar to how the scraper plane is used. And finally, a lot of times I like to finish up with card scraper. This is a little more difficult to use. This is a flexible one, which sometimes allows me to get into tight areas, give a little flex and dish it out a little bit more. I would start with a more rigid scraper if I were to use that. Today I'm going to start with the plane, and you can see I've passed over the throat, and right there I'm picking up that protrusion. So we're about done. Once I get this down, see it's cutting at the throat. At this point, I would hold it up the light, much like you saw before, check my progress. Ooh, we're looking pretty good. I think we can refine that. We're making contact here, making contact there, and it's not absolutely necessary to make contact behind here. Usually this is relieved very, very slightly. These 2 points are the critical points that need to make contact with the work. Depending what you're using the plane for, a smoothing plane, this is relieved slightly. A jack plane, it's relieved more. A truing plane, this, you have a third contact point back behind here. So I'm going to refine this a little bit, because what happens, I tap that blade down to working, this will push that down a little bit more. So I'm going to work right up to the blade edge. Well, there's a concept of flatness for someone without the machinery, keeping an area within, the entire area within 10,000ths of an inch of flat is a pretty daunting prospect, and was not available, shall we say, 300, 500, 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago. They've been planing for millennia, and yet the planes function. So functionally, we need two areas to contact to work in order for the plane to do its job. This is the start of the cut, which is right here, and right at the throat. These are the two reference areas which must contact to work. In order to simplify flattening, we relieve everything between those 2 points. And the back of the plane has different configurations. Truing plane, we would have a third point back here. A jack plane is relieved somewhat substantially, which is basically only maybe 1/100th of an inch or less. And a smoothing plane, just a few thousandths. So these two areas are what we're concerned with, and we just relieve it in between. And we do that on the Japanese plane, usually with a scraper. As I said, we have other tools. I'm going to use a scraper here to get started. We know this area is high. I'm going to scrape it. This is done 90 degrees, maybe at a little bit of an angle. And then we want this area maybe that wide, to be our contact areas. So we relieve everything in between. Now, if this were a used plane, I first check this because this will get worn down. And let's make sure that's flat, nice and flat. Let's take a few more strokes here. All right, let's check with the straight edge. You can knock the shavings out that you might have when you are planing, or like I just had some dust in there. Cup your hand like that. That'll keep you from cutting your hand, but it'll also blow the shavings out of there. So, not too bad. You can see through it. We could, I don't know if we get, maybe if I sharpen the blade, get a little bit sharper. I mean, a little bit thinner. So, it's working. The only other thing you have to do is, these are sharp, round those over. This is kept sharp so that shaving and stuff don't run underneath. Knock these corners off because I've actually split the corners off when you're tapping it carelessly. And lubricate. This helps a lot and helps save the blade.